Thanks, everyone. Welcome. I'm pleased that some of you have shown up for my live lecture. As I said earlier, I do have recorded lectures posted, but I think that it is better for students to have an opportunity to have a live lecture and also to be able to interact if you have comments or questions as well. So I'm going to give you a lecture summary, and what I can also do, because it's a very quick, short 6-week class, we're already into week 2, is when I cover material that will be on a quiz or test, I can say, here's a topic that you need to know. So it's a way of creating sort of an informal study guide for yourself as we go along. So the topic for today is the Industrial Revolution in the United States. I think about history a lot, probably more than I should. And I have formed some conclusions. And I think one of the lessons about history, particularly from this period, is a reminder of what can happen when we romanticize the past. People often like to talk about the good old days and how things used to be so much better back in the day. And that normally comes from a dissatisfaction with the present. But the reality is that when you take a really close look, the so-called good old days may not have been as good as people like to think they were. I'm not saying everything in the past was bad, but there's a tendency to romanticize the past. The reality is that the 19th century, following the Civil War and going into the early 20th century, was a period of great change, but also great conflict. This is when the Industrial Revolution, which had started certainly before the Civil War and played a major role in the Civil War, it really accelerates at the end of the 19th century, going into the early 20th century. And for better or for worse, I still can't make up my mind, the technology that we use today has its origins during this period of time. I'm sitting to you in front of a computer screen doing an online lecture. That would not be possible without the computer, without the internet, without electricity. I'm sitting in my home. I have the air conditioning on so that it doesn't get uncomfortable. The technology that we are accustomed to and dependent on, the foundation of that technology is developed during this period. It is during this period that we see electricity being harnessed for the first time on a larger scale. It is during this period that steel will be produced on an industrial scale. It is during this period, that fossil fuels, petroleum, will become a dominant fuel source in the United States. It's during this time period that we will see the telegraph and the telephone, and later on, radio, motion pictures, recorded sound, the portable camera. If you were to live in, let's say, 1900, 1910, obviously the world would be very different, and a lot of the technology that you are familiar with today would not exist, but you'd recognize some of it. And it was revolutionary, and it changed the world in both good and bad ways. So how does the Industrial Revolution change the United States? Well, you have a change where goods that were normally produced in relatively small quantity can now be produced on an industrial scale. You now have factory-made goods. The earliest example of this, of course, would be the textile industry, which is the manufacture of cloth for clothing. unless a person were very wealthy, ordinary people didn't have a large wardrobe because what you had was custom made, basically. Clothing, shoes. I mean, you need clothing, you go to a tailor or a dressmaker. You need shoes, you go to a shoemaker. You need furniture made, you go to a carpenter. Now, goods can be produced in a way and on a scale that had never been seen before. So, what's good about that is it increases the availability of goods and it also lowers the price. But these goods are now being produced in factories, and there will be a lessening demand for skilled labor and a growing demand for unskilled labor. So, and unskilled labor, people who work who are not, skilled craftsmen or artisans, they're not going to be paid as much, and they are easily replaceable. And working conditions in late 19th century, early 20th century factories was dismal, to say the least, and that's putting it mildly. We also have, in addition to the use of petroleum, meaning oil, coal is a very widely used fuel source and energy source. And regardless of your position on environmental issues, the reality is that coal and oil, when burned in a large quantity, does have an environmental impact with regard to air quality. So this is a period of great change. It is also a period where a large amount of wealth is being concentrated in the hands of a very few, and that is going to lead to social unrest. At the end of the 19th century, there is no income tax. There are really no rules here. Business owners can more or less do what they want. It's a period where we see the formation of the modern corporation and the large corporation. And as I say, there are really no rules here. At the end of the 19th century, I think it was 1886, Congress passes the Sherman Antitrust Act to try to, at least do something to prevent unfair competition and unfair business practices, and to try to prevent the domination of monopolies. But it's, it's a drop of water in a desert, really. It's just the beginning. There is no minimum wage, there is no income tax, there is no workers' compensation, or, employees are not receiving, benefits the way that we would think of it today. I mean, some companies had better policies than others, but there was, no real regulation whatsoever. And so this is going to lead to the rise of the organized labor movement, what we call unions. And it isn't like business owners and corporations are simply going to sit back and allow unions to organize and form without resistance. So there are going to be labor strikes, and there are going to be labor protests, and there will be violence, and people will get killed. The 1880s and 1890s is in many ways a scary time. Not only that, following the Civil War, starting in 1872, there was an economic depression. About 20 years later, in 1893, there was another one. So one of the problems of an industrial economy is that when it isn't doing well, the damage that can be done to large segments of the population can be extreme. I mean, look, just think about what the coronavirus pandemic has done to so many people over the past year and a half. I know people who, were in the service industry, restaurants, hair and nail salons and things of that nature, who did not survive or have barely survived, and who almost lost everything they had. People have lost work. Certainly there has been a psychological impact from all this. So, when the economy is functioning well, it helps to create sort of a stable social cohesion. But when the economy is not doing well, and people are losing their jobs, or they can't feed their families, or people are working at wages that are so low that, they're basically working hand to mouth just as a subsistence living, that's going to lead to problems too. I mean, take my word for it, you would not enjoy working in a late 19th century, early 20th century coal mine or factory or steel mill. Conditions were abysmal and dangerous. This is also a world where child labor was a common problem. This is a world where cities are becoming overcrowded and polluted, and there are some real serious problems. So when people talk about, oh, things used to be so much better back in the day, it was a simpler time and all the rest, well, that's true if you leave out certain things. And I'm not even talking about the fact that if you were dealing with the South, you're still dealing with the Jim Crow system of racial segregation. This is a world where women do not have the right to vote yet. So the good old days have their, let's just say they have their ups and downs. So let's take a closer look. An industrial economy requires certain things to function. Certainly you need a labor source. You need people to do the work. And a lot, not all, but a lot of the labor that was available during the late 19th, early 20th century was provided by immigrant labor. There was a huge wave of immigrants who came to the United States at the end of the 19th century and early 20th century, my ancestors among them. And I'll talk more about that in another time. But, workers, people, men and women who were just getting off the boat from Italy or from Russia or Poland, we're talking Southern and Eastern Europe primarily, they're going to need work. And a lot of these people are going to work in factories and coal mines and steel mills, and they will do construction projects, and it will be work where they will be working very hard for very little pay. And a lot of the work is dangerous, and workers are viewed more or less as a cog in a machine, easily replaced. So you need a labor force to be able to do the work. But there are other key ingredients that define a modern industrial economy. Being able to produce steel on an industrial level is critical. And for the first time, thanks to what is called the Bessemer process, steel can now be produced on an industrial scale. I mean, I'm not a science teacher, nor am I a chemist. Steel, of course, is made from iron ore. And what this process does basically is it forces air into the molten iron ore, and the oxygen molecule bonds to the carbon molecule. Again, I'm not really someone who can explain all the scientific and technical elements of it. But basically, the technology now exists to produce steel on a scale that it had never been produced before. And what that means is you can now build things that you couldn't build before. You can build a bridge across the Mississippi River. You can build railroads, and you can build skyscrapers. Steel is the ingredient that allows America to build a modern infrastructure. So that's critical. So we have labor, we have steel. Oil. I mean, there is a big debate going on right now as people feel that we need to try and get away from fossil fuels like oil. The reality is that we still use an awful lot of oil. Of course, oil is used to make gasoline, but oil back then was used primarily as a heat source and a source for light. Oil used as kerosene, which is pretty stinky and smelly and frankly dangerous. If you have a kerosene lamp and knock it over, you can set your house on fire. But we have oil being used as a heat source and a light source. And then when the internal combustion engine is created, now we have oil being refined into gasoline, and now we have a whole nother source of use for petroleum. As I said earlier, coal is a major source for heat and also for powering, steam engines and so on. I mean, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the story of the Titanic and the early transatlantic cruise liners. I mean, they're powered, their boilers are being, heated with coal. So coal and oil are both critical components of the late 19th century, early 20th century economy. So we have oil, coal, steel, a labor force. And then, of course, also we will see the development of electricity. And of course, electricity first came to, the modern cities, places like New York. It would take a while before electricity would be available to people throughout the country. In many ways, I think of the development of electricity the way I think of the development of the internet. I remember when internet first became more common, and certain areas had it, certain areas didn't. They were waiting for internet to come to them, and gradually now more and more people have access to internet and Wi-Fi, but it wasn't like that at the beginning. So same thing with electricity. So electricity is important. Now think about this. If you remove any one of these items from our daily lives, if all of a sudden there is no electricity, everything stops. And of course, when we are at risk of power failure or blackout or having the power cut off, I mean, look, without electricity, we don't use our computers, we don't charge our cell phones, we don't use our air conditioning, our refrigerators. I mean, in a way, when the electricity is out, we become helpless. So we are certainly very dependent on technology. I mean, imagine if we didn't have steel. There would be no modern buildings. There would be no automobiles or railroads or modern roads and bridges. I mean, that are made with steel, that have, or freeway overpasses and underpasses that have steel reinforced concrete. So every one of these items that I mentioned is critical to life, not only during the period of the late 19th century and early 20th century, but also critical to our lives today. And as I say, these items can make our lives comfortable. Electricity allows us to sit in air-conditioned rooms. And of course, how nice is it that we have hot and cold running water and refrigerators and freezers and all the rest, and cars to drive. But the reality is that we're also very dependent. I mean, if gasoline isn't available, if electricity isn't available, there are many people who, if God forbid, their Wi-Fi is down and their phone isn't working, it's like a personal crisis. So, but a lot of this technology was developed during this period, and it was revolutionary. I am older than most of my students generally when I teach a class. So I am able to tell you that I remember, the first time I ever got on the internet, or the first time that I ever sent or received a text message. My son, who's 10 years old, was born into a world where this technology is already there. It wasn't there. It didn't exist when I was born. So I witnessed it happening. Just sitting here now in front of a computer screen teaching an online class the way I am is something that would have been science fiction when I was a child. I mean, what I'm doing right now is something that would have been part of a Star Trek episode. So that's the only good thing about getting older, is that you get to witness changes in technology, which some people do not welcome very much because they don't want to have to learn how to use new technology. For better or worse, it's here and we have to adapt to it. Thomas Edison is a name you need to know. Long after I'm gone, nobody will know who I was, but we'll still talk about Thomas Edison. How interesting it would be. Imagine if someone said, well, what do you do for a living? And your answer was, well, I'm an inventor. I invent new technologies. Thomas Edison did not personally, by himself, invent movies, recorded sound, electricity, the light bulb. He didn't like personally just, walk out of his front door and say, look, here it is, I've invented this. What Thomas Edison was good at doing was coming up with a general idea of what he wanted to do, understanding what the technical problems were, and then bringing in the people that he needed to put together a team to figure it out and come up with a solution. So it's Thomas Edison who put together the team that he needed that created, as I say, recorded sound, motion pictures, electricity in the home, the electric light bulb. He was a brilliant man, ambitious, not the greatest businessman, but certainly good at solving technical problems. And he wasn't always right. One of the stories I like to tell about Thomas Edison is that he hired a young European immigrant by the name of Nikola Tesla, who was a real genius, frankly, and superior to Edison in his understanding of electricity. And Edison had developed these power stations running on direct current. And Tesla said, look, alternating current is the way to go, because you can use the power and you can send the power through wire over a greater distance. And Edison didn't want to hear it, but in the end, it was Tesla who was correct. And alternating current is the system that powers our electrical grid today. But there are some big names that you need to know. They are overwhelmingly male. And you need to be aware of the fact that, look, at the end of the 19th century, opportunities for women and opportunities for people who were, ethnic minorities were limited. Are there some famous people in the sciences and with technology and in business who were not men? Very few. I often think of, in Europe, Madame Curie, who did a lot of scientific work understanding the principles of radioactivity. But there are very few. This is a world where, there's a lot of talk today about race and gender and discrimination and all the rest, but I really don't feel you can compare the present with the past. Today, people have opportunities that simply would have been unthinkable at the end of the 19th century and early 20th century. Remember that during this period, racial segregation is still being legally enforced in the South. Women don't have the right to vote. This is a very limited world, and to suggest that we haven't made any progress, I'll simply say that I wouldn't want to live during this period at all, for any reason. So let me move along. I want you to be aware, of course, of Thomas Edison. This is also the birth of the modern corporation. And there are key individuals who establish industries that they absolutely dominate. Do we have a modern day equivalent? In a way, I think we do. I think when you think of Amazon, for example, which is, for better or worse, it is a very profitable, very large corporation. And Jeff Bezos is the man who is generally given the credit for helping to establish Amazon. And he is certainly, if not the wealthiest man in the world, he's certainly one of them. And then I think of Bill Gates with Microsoft. And of course, there's Steve Jobs, who is no longer alive, but who helped make Apple what it is today. And then, of course, in the world of investments and in banking and finance, there's Warren Buffett. So there are modern day versions. And then, of course, let's not forget Elon Musk with Tesla. Of course, the Tesla car company is named after Nikola Tesla, who is the man who invented the electric motor, by the way. So, think of all the people who are driving Tesla automobiles. I wonder how many of them actually know that it's named after Nikola Tesla, who, lived, I think he died in the, early 1940s. And in the late 19th century, early 20th century, it was Nikola Tesla who developed the electric motor that makes the Tesla automobile possible. So there are big names today, but let's talk about some of the big names of the past. And do you need to know them? The answer is yes. Certainly, I would like you to know who Thomas Edison was. And for example, when I talk about Amazon, you think to yourself, well, Jeff Bezos. So when I talk about Facebook, you say Mark Zuckerberg. And when I talk about Tesla automobiles, you think of Elon Musk. And Microsoft, you think Bill Gates. Well, let's go back to an earlier time. Let's talk about a late 19th century equivalent. When I talk about oil, the name that has to come to mind, or should, is John D. Rockefeller, who established the Standard Oil Company, one of the largest oil companies, well, at the time, the largest oil company in the world. With Andrew Carnegie, we have Carnegie Steel. I want you to be aware of who Andrew Carnegie was with the steel industry. And when it comes to banking and finance, the ultimate has to be J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan is not only a genius when it comes to banking and finance, but he was also very good at reorganizing companies. You may have heard of some of the companies that J.P. Morgan has been involved with. Of course, J.P. Morgan partnered with Thomas Edison to establish Edison Electric. And then when Morgan realized that, direct current is not the way to go and Edison was wrong, he pushes Edison out of Edison Electric and starts a new company you may have heard of called General Electric, which still exists today. Those of you who bank with Chase Bank, the full name of that bank is J.P. Morgan Chase. It was also J.P. Morgan who bought out Andrew Carnegie, who wanted to sell, I think, and bought out Carnegie Steel and renamed it U.S. Steel. Of all the rich and powerful men of this period, the one who is the most impressive to me and the most, in a way, I suppose, a little scary is J.P. Morgan. I mean, J.P. Morgan, in my opinion, he is the Darth Vader of American business. And he's both impressive and a little scary, but this is a man who knew what he was doing, utterly ruthless in business. Most all of them were. I would say of all of these powerful men I'm talking about, the one who probably struggled with the ruthlessness element of it the most would probably have been Andrew Carnegie. And I think that's one of the reasons in the end why he was willing to sell out to JP Morgan and get out of his business, because he didn't want to be remembered simply as a ruthless businessman. And he wanted to be known as much for his philanthropic work and so on. But I want you to know who these people are. I want you to know when I talk about trusts, what I mean. Using the word trust, a trust is another way of saying monopoly. Well, what is a monopoly? A monopoly is when you have a single individual or company that completely dominates an industry. The problem with that is that you end up with a lack of competition, and with a lack of competition, monopolies can basically charge whatever they want. If you've ever played the board game Monopoly, the object of the game is to defeat your competitors and you own the whole board. So then it doesn't really matter where somebody lands, they're paying you anyway. So it's a great way of learning about basic economics, really. Play the game Monopoly. And there were no rules to this game. They could do whatever they wanted to do. These are sharks. These are great white sharks, and they are the dominant predator. And so, for example, if there is a rival oil company and John D. Rockefeller wants to take over that oil company, he can work out a deal with the railroads to make sure that oil company will be unable to transport their oil to a refinery, or that they will have to pay more to do it. So is this a sleazy way to do business? Is it a ruthless way to do business? Absolutely. But if you were to ask John D. Rockefeller about this, his answer would be, I've never done anything illegal. And it's true. If driving your competitors out of business by squeezing their supplies or their transportation, if it's not illegal, it's not illegal. There are things that businesses could do then to try and get rid of their competitors that simply would not stand today. the funny thing about John D. Rockefeller is he was actually a very religious man. He used to teach Sunday school. He was a devout Christian, and he believed that it was his mission on earth, that God put him on earth to build, for the benefit of the world's best and biggest and most efficient oil company. He believed that. So, in his mind, anyone who was going to get in his way is getting in his way of what he thought was a greater good. So it's very interesting. I would like to recommend a documentary series to you if you have a chance to watch it. It's one of the best I've seen. It's on the History Channel, called The Men Who Built America. And again, if that sounds, not especially inclusive, consider the fact that, look, I mean, the idea that women back then were going to be able to, go into business and start or develop a major industry simply was not going to be possible during this period. As I said earlier, women didn't even have the right to vote yet. So this is very much a male-dominated world. So, when people talk about, diversity and opportunity for people of different racial backgrounds and ethnic backgrounds and gender, you can't compare the modern world to, the 1890s and early 20th century. I mean, there were real obstacles that made it very impossible. I mean, I'm not saying that it's easy today and that it's necessarily a level playing field for everyone, but you didn't even get on the field, at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, unless you were a white male. You didn't even get on the field, let alone having a level playing field. You didn't make it to the field. So, but I do recommend this documentary series called The Men Who Built America. I want you to be aware of John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie and J.P. Morgan. There are elements of this period that are rather distasteful. A concept that I don't particularly enjoy discussing is called social Darwinism, which was a belief that, since white European-based societies were more successful, that they were naturally superior, and that there was a racial element to that superiority. It's called social Darwinism. I have a question. Why wasn't Thomas Edison a smart businessman? Thomas Edison was much better at inventing technology than marketing it and selling it. And I'm sure many of you know someone like this who is very good at developing a product or coming up with an idea, but they're not a very good business person. I have a friend who's a chef, and he's a wonderful chef, but he's not a very good business person. And so, he can open up a restaurant, but he's probably going to struggle to make money with it. He's good at the cooking part. He's not good at the business part. And that's how I think of Edison. He was much better at the inventing than the selling and the running of the business. And in that area, in terms of like running a business, you will not do better than J.P. Morgan. Although, as I said, Morgan was utterly ruthless. As I say, I call him the Darth Vader of American business during this period. Factory work was difficult. It was dangerous. Workers were killed in accidents all the time. And it is during this period that we see an organized labor movement. I would like you to be aware of that. The idea of trying to form labor unions, which would allow workers to bargain collectively for better working conditions and better wages. One of the early leaders of the organized labor movement was a man named Samuel Gompers, who tried to form the American Federation of Labor. And in the end, there are going to be, unions for garment workers, and later on auto workers, and there will be labor unions for just about anything you can think of. I myself, a lot of people who are in education are members of the teachers union. The idea that when you are negotiating for wages and working conditions, that if you are able to do so as a group, it gives you more leverage to get what you want in negotiation. And of course, there was a lot of pushback to this as well. there were strikes and often there were protests, many of which ended violently. So, I'd like you to be aware of that as well. There are several incidents that are particularly violent that I would like you to know. The first is known as Haymarket Square, which happened on May 4th, 1886. There was a labor protest in Chicago in an area called Haymarket Square. Someone threw a bomb at the police, and basically all hell broke loose. So I want you to be aware of Haymarket Square, and I have a video clip I'm going to show you shortly. Then there is a violent incident at one of Andrew Carnegie's steel mills in 1892 in Pennsylvania in what is called the Homestead Strike. That's another one that I would like you to know. And the last one I want to focus on is known as the Pullman Strike, which I believe is 1894. Let me get the Pullman Strike. Yes, it started in May and went through July 1894. So, I mean, here we are, 1886, you have Haymarket Square, 1892, the Homestead Strike, and 1894, the Pullman Strike. So things are escalating during this period, and not in a good way. So I do have a few very brief video clips I want to show you, and then we'll begin to wrap things up. So bear with me, please. All right, I'm a little technologically challenged. Here we go.
I'm Uhuru Williams, I'm a historian, and here's what you need to know in order to sound smart about the Haymarket Square Riot. The Haymarket Square Riot of 1886 had its origins in labor unrest that extended back to the decades after the Civil War. American laborers were particularly concerned about issues including the length of the workday and working conditions. The American labor movement at that time was also being influenced by more radical voices. Many of these individuals believed that not only should working conditions be improved, but that the entire capitalistic enterprise be smashed. On May 3rd, 1886, several workers were killed by police in a showdown at the McCormick Reaper plant in Chicago. Labor organizers called for a mass meeting and rally the following night at Haymarket Square, after one speaker, Samuel Felden, made a particularly inflammatory statement. Police moved in to shut down the rally. As they were moving toward the stage, however, an unknown person tossed a bomb in their midst. In the ensuing violence, 7 police officers were killed, and as many as 5 civilians wounded. In the absence of any real suspects, authorities turned their attention to the more radical influences in the labor movement. Despite the lack of any tangible evidence, 8 men were eventually arrested and put on trial. All 8 were convicted. In the end, 4 of those convicted were executed on November 11, 1887. Of the 3 remaining who had been convicted, 1 committed suicide, and the other 2 were ultimately pardoned by the governor of Illinois due to a public backlash against the unfair way in which the defendants had been treated. The 4 men who were executed in 1887 became international symbols of the struggle between capital and labor and the fight to ensure fair labor practices for all workers.
Okay, and I want to show you a very brief video clip about the Homestead Strike and then also the Pullman Strike.
June 1892. A strike at the Andrew Carnegie-owned steel plant in Homestead, Pennsylvania, escalated into one of the bloodiest labor battles the country had seen. The Homestead Strike came during a period of intense unrest. Thousands of men and women fought for the right to strike, to form unions, and to establish a 40-hour work week. They were met with force from police, from soldiers, and from the hired armed guards of the Pinkerton Detective Agency. On June 25th, workers called a strike. Henry Clay Frick, plant manager, closed the mill and locked them out. Then he called in the Pinkertons. 2 weeks later, in the middle of the night, 300 Pinkertons crammed onto barges and were towed 10 miles up the Monongahela River to Homestead. Armed workers were waiting on the riverbank. At dawn, a pitched battle broke out. 12 hours later, 3 Pinkertons and 7 strikers lay dead.
Railroad tycoon George Pullman paid his workers unusually high wages, but in return, he expected them to pay high rents to live in his company town. It worked until the Panic of 1893.
The nation plunges into a terrible recession, a deep economic depression that's going to spike unemployment and cause all kinds of difficulties.
Pullman slashed his workers' pay by 25%, but he refused to lower the cost of his company housing. Pullman's workers felt trapped. They couldn't afford their rent, but they couldn't afford to leave their jobs either. So in May of 1894,
they walked off those jobs in protest.
I'll let you listen to it because the video part's not working, but I'll just let you listen to the audio.
It is one of the epic strikes in American history. And it's led by a man named Eugene Debs, who's head of the American Railway Union.
Eugene Debs used his influence to convince 250,000 other railroad workers around the country to walk off their jobs in sympathy with the Pullman workers, essentially shutting down all rail traffic from Chicago to the West Coast.
And the strike spreads because it's a rail strike. It actually has national implications. And there's a lot of violence, a lot of destruction of property, which plays into the hands of those who oppose the strike and oppose Debs, who is a self-styled radical and socialist.
One of the people who opposed Debs was President Grover Cleveland. He sent 2,500 federal troops to Chicago to stop the strike over the objections of the governor of Illinois.
Cleveland sent them in anyway, on the pretext that these trains moved U.S. mails, and that his job was to make sure that the postal system was able to deliver the mail.
The troops arrived on July 4th. Violence broke out. Mobs destroyed rail equipment, and troops began shooting strikers. By the end of July, 34 strikers were dead, and the Pullman strike was over.
And so it's a vivid example of how the power of industry and, in this case, the federal government, were still very much lined up against organized labor in the late 19th century.
Okay. Well, I think you get an idea. Those are the 3 big, very violent moments I want you to be aware of: the Haymarket Square incident in 1886, Homestead Strike 1892, Pullman Strike 1894. So there was a lot of social unrest and a lot of problems. So the idea that our society was more cohesive and it was an easier, simpler time, it just, it doesn't really hold up when you take a closer look. So this is a summary of the main topics that I want to cover today. I have other recorded lectures for you where I have other information and video clips and different things. So what I'd like to do now is make it available for you. If anyone has any questions, now is the time to do that. And if not, then you are free to go.